Okay. All right, good. There, did you guys get a handout? There's a handout back there that has the scripture on it and the questions on the back. Well, we are looking at chapter 3, and probably the passage that's most memorable to most people. If you say the book of Ecclesiastes, somebody somewhere is going to start singing to everything. Turn, turn, turn. Yeah, that's the birds. The birds. The birds. Yeah. So just a quick orientation here. So clearly, verses 1 through 8 are poetry, which excites me no end because I love poetry and I love reading biblical. Hebrew poetry is really, really fun to read if you get just a few little tidbits about how they did rhyming and so forth and so on. What I'm presuming, this is Solomon. I don't know what David has said his opinion is, but I'm presuming that Solomon is writing this. And he's using a literary device called merism, M-E-R-I-S-M. And merism is when you have two contrasting things. You put them in a formula, in a sentence. And what they mean is these two ends of the spectrum plus everything in between. That's your. So an example would be, we say heaven and earth, or we say, I searched high and low, which means it wasn't just that we went high and low, but we went all over the house. Day and night, yin or yang, those are examples of merism. So that's why you get the born, die, plant, pluck up, kill, heal kind of thing. And he says, for everything, there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. The older translations say a time for every purpose under heaven. I like the word purpose better because I think it gives the intent of the Hebrew word, which is these are not random things. If you look here, these are actual intentional, deliberate activities that humans do. I'm not talking about a tree limb falling or a tornado coming or it raining or something like that that feels random to us. Everything here has a purpose. And that's what he's talking about. And you're coming out of that context that you guys discussed for a couple of weeks about finding some meaning, some purpose, some joy in your labor. And David was saying that we had two Davids. You had one David was saying that what Solomon was saying is that you need to find joy in the labor itself, what you're doing itself. And I think David Andrews was saying, yeah, but what about the success or the result? And the answer is yes. I think maybe I don't think Solomon, if he were sitting here, he wouldn't be saying, I'm not talking about the result of your labor. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he was saying, we tend to only get joy out of the results of our labor when we're successful. I'm trying to teach you, I think Solomon would say, that the journey itself, not just the destination, you can have joy in it because God created us for that. And I've learned, and I'll apply this to men, I'm sure it's true of women, but I'll let the ladies, have their own conclusion about this. But as a guy, most men I meet hate their jobs. Or they may not hate, that may be too strong, but they really don't like their job, and it's not what they really want to do. But they're doing it out of obligation or out of principle or whatever. And I think Solomon is saying, hey, pause for just a minute and realize that if you're looking at this world the way it is, you're going to see the repetition, the constant repetition of inane stuff that's going to drive you nuts. And he takes 12 chapters to explain all that. So if you don't find a way to find joy in living your life in the midst of that boredom and that tedium, you're going to miss the point. And if you only tie your happiness, your joy, to the success of your business or your toil, your task, then you're going to be seriously disappointed along the way. You'll have some of that, but you're not going to have probably a lot of that in a world that's already designed to be against you. So he states the idea, the thesis, if you will, in the first verse when he says, for everything there's a season, a time for every matter or every purpose under heaven. And then he illustrates that, a time to be born, a time to die. It's interesting, in ancient Near East wisdom literature, that's very common, that you would start with the biggest category. First day of your life, last day of your life. Okay, now that everything else I'm going to give you is underneath that, in that spectrum between being born and being dead. So God determines the time when we're born. He determines the time when we die. A time to plant and to pluck up, that's pretty obvious. That's the agrarian society that they lived in. Time to kill and a time to heal. I think we don't realize, drop down to the very last one. It says a time for war and a time for peace. I get this argument every once in a while. It's normally a younger person that says to me, I don't like all the war and all the destruction in the Bible. And there's a part, I want to be sensitive. But there's a part of me that wants to say, God uses war, get over it. And it's very clear from Genesis to Revelation. The Bible starts out with Cain and Abel and ends with Jesus on a white horse slaying all of his enemies. War is a theme that has a righteous component to it. And I would encourage you, if you're a reader, take some time to read sometime Augustine's just war theory. Augustine, great theologian of the 4th century AD, he actually worked through when and how would war be just and what would be the result of it and how would we deal with it and so forth. So kill, to heal, to break down, to build up, to weep, to laugh, mourn, to dance, to cast away stones. I think this is an illustration. In the ancient days, in Solomon's time, they used to punish a farmer by throwing stones in his field. Because the first thing you would do if you got a plot of land is you take the stones out of the field so you can work the field and plant crops. So he's picturing there's a time when the discipline of the community is putting these stones in your field, but there's also a time for everybody to go out like the Amish did, and pick all the stones up for their fellow farmer. To embrace, a time to refrain from embracing. When I read that, I was thinking about Jeremiah. God said to Jeremiah, what was that? Yeah. There you go. That should have been our theme verse.
You should have just said that. Just put it on the door. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. So next time we have a pandemic, we'll let you do the sign. I think it was not Jeremiah, but it was Ezekiel that God said, your wife is going to die, but I do not want you to weep and mourn publicly. I mean, how hard is that? And his point he was making is that God's going to judge Israel, and they're not to weep about it. There are those times when we weep out loud, but there are times when we don't. I find this as a pastor. I go into someone's home, someone has just died. I want to be tender, I want to be there, I want to be present, I want to listen, but being out of control weeping does not help the situation if the guy who's in charge is doing that. There's a time to weep and mourn. There's a time to not do that and so forth. And so you get the point. But the larger point here, and this is what I want to get to that will help you guys think through the questions that I've written for you. In ancient wisdom literature, time is a major theme. And it's a major theme. Time is a practical theme for us. Getting things done, hurrying, time is money, so forth. But for the ancients, they were literally dependent upon the sun and the moon and the rain and the seasons. Their whole life was ordered around that. If suddenly we had a snowstorm here, it would be weird, but we would still get on with our life. But in the ancient days, time was really important, and time in proper time, things in proper time, was very important. So it was a theme of a lot of ancient literature. In my book that I wrote on poetry, in the foreword, I was thinking about this today. I wrote, "To everything there's a season," wrote King Solomon almost 3,000 years ago, "and a time for every purpose under heaven. With those words, he described the reality of time as the primary vehicle that drives our human experience. Everything about us is affected by our relationship with time. We speak of the tyranny of the urgent or of wasting time. We worry about time as money and therefore must be spent wisely. Because we seem so driven by time, it is difficult to see time as what it truly is, a wonderful gift from God that allows us to mark our existence and our sense of progress of moving forward. For the Christian, this sense of movement is not only very real, but is also extremely encouraging. In fact, it is what gives us hope. You were just talking about this a moment ago. What gives us hope is that the experience you had this afternoon that you were describing to me, which was very distasteful to you, there's coming a time, yet future to us, hopefully not too far from now, that's not going to happen anymore. And that's going to be a great time. Because life is not static, but constantly moving forward, we can begin to believe that the same God who gave us a beginning also has a tremendous end in sight for us. And then I go on to talk about how we're marked by seasons in our life, seasons of rejoicing, seasons of lament, wonderful seasons of productivity, and sometimes we feel like failures. This is what Solomon's talking about, that there's something about a person who loves Yahweh, that even the most tedious things can become meaningful and joyful and purposeful if we can have that perspective. There was a guy at the church we were at before, CFC, named George Huntley. George was an amazing guy. He was the maintenance guy at the church. Very smart guy. He was a retired air traffic controller, but just loved to work around the church. He was a disaster. As far, he was always, in fact, he died falling at the church, putting up Christmas decorations. He fell back and they hauled him off, and he never regained consciousness. He was that dangerous about stuff. Yeah, but he was so joyful. I remember walking in the men's room one day, and I heard George in a stall on his knees whistling. And he was cleaning the toilet. And I said, George, you're pretty excited about that toilet. And he looked at me with the most innocent, wonderful face, and he said, this toilet belongs to Jesus. And I love washing it for him. Well, yeah, we all love to hear stories like that, and then we come back to reality and go, I'm not going to be happy scrubbing a toilet. But some of the ancient monks were this way. They would do their daily task with such a joy and such an infusion of what it meant to serve God. We're going to get to that in just a few verses in Colossians about doing your work heartily unto the Lord and not for men, because it's the Lord Christ whom you serve. But the point of this part of this passage is that wisdom, a wise person, is a person who knows and has the perspective that he's trying to teach us. And so there are several things to that perspective. I'll tell you what they are. First of all, a wise person is a person who understands that there is an appropriate time for everything. An appropriate time for everything. A wise person understands that there's a beginning and an end to things. A lot of the trauma in our life is when God is moving us into another season. So your daughter's going off to college, and you and she are fighting like crazy, and what's going on there is that you're just sad and grieving that your daughter's leaving, and it's just a season. It's just a season for transition. There are questions. If you leave certain questions unanswered in that transition, you carry those questions with you for the rest of your life if you don't deal with them. Our children have to grow up. We have to move on to another job. Sometimes we move on to another church. Sometimes we lose loved ones. It's really, really traumatic when something seems out of sequence. When your 96-year-old grandfather dies, you go, well, that's sad, but he was 96 years old. But when, like a friend of ours, recently. In fact, I think on Monday I'll probably go to this funeral. 17-year-old boy in a car wreck. That just seems wrong. There's no way to explain that. But a wise person understands that there's an appropriate time for everything, that things begin and they end. And I'm noticing, we need to train our children and grandchildren with this. Because when you're a child, everything just goes on forever. And if something's fun, they want to do it over and over and over and over again. And one of the things we know about children, we know that they're growing up and becoming more adult-like, is when they understand, when they can postpone their gratification, when they understand that they have to let go of things and move on to the next thing and so forth. A wise person, a wise parent, a wise grandparent teaches that. Here's an interesting one. A wise person understands the reality that there are opposite things in the world. And that things being opposite are not necessarily bad. We look down here, and I would rather be born than die. I'd rather plant than pluck up. I'd rather heal than kill. I'd rather be built up than, I'd rather laugh and dance and gather stones and embrace and seek. We want to do all those things. What Solomon is saying is a wise person, a biblically wise person, understands that these things, they end. Everything has an end in this life. That's why we're so excited about the next life. A wise person understands that when we're in a certain season, that there's an appropriate time to talk and an appropriate time not to talk. Classic example, Job. They were doing fine until they opened their mouth. And if you just read what Job's counselors said, if that was just the book of Job, that's all you had, you would say that's the most biblical counseling class I've ever heard in my life. Because the things they said were true, so many of them were true, some of them were not. And you get to the end and God's really angry at them. Because number one, some of the things they said was wrong, but number two, what you were saying is just not appropriate. There's a time, grief has to be witnessed. Part of being with people that are hurting is just be quiet. I've heard it over and over and over again.
Talking to our wives is just being quiet.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a wonderful example.
Oh, I know. I know my mother-in-law said that.
Yeah, and not trying to fix it and not trying to interrupt and mansplain, But, yeah, I've heard it a lot over the years when I've been in the home of someone who's lost a loved one or at a memorial service or whatever. They'll say this, Pastor, I don't remember much of what you said, but I will never forget that you were there. And there's a tremendous power of presence. And I think what he's saying, if you read the next couple of verses, verse 9, what gain has the worker from his toil? We've already talked about that. I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. There's a negative connotation to that. I've looked at this thing that God has given us to live, and it's not that great. But then he says, by contrast to that, he says, verse 11, he has made everything beautiful in its time. And so what that says to me is that we can view the circumstances of our life, the choices that we make, the choices that other people make, we can view those things as tedious and boring and painful and hurtful and struggle, or we can pause and say that there's something about when God gets involved in that there's something beautiful that comes out of that. When God is in charge of, and when we learn to trust God with the timing of things in our life, there's a beauty to what God is doing. And sometimes we don't see that beauty until we look back on it years later or days later. But there's something about God always being able to redeem. I mean, I thought, of course, of Romans 8:28. God takes all things and he works them together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. See? Everything has a purpose. So and there's another verse that Paul wrote. He said, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God for you. He didn't say for everything. Huh?
In Colossians 3, where we are,
Yeah.
3 times.
He doesn't say for everything give thanks. He says in everything give thanks. There are things on here that I don't thank God that children die of cancer. I don't thank God for that. I don't thank God that, war happens. But in the context of those things, we can learn to give thanks because what he infuses into every human action in every human situation, either now in time or space or later when we stand before him, everything that's ever been done will find its place in the beauty of what God has prepared for us. Tim Keller said one time recently, if we knew everything that God knows, we would ask for exactly what he's giving us. If you could see what God sees, then we would ask him to do exactly what he's doing. And I think that's part of what Paul means when he says, when he says we've been raised and seated with Christ in the heavenlies. I think what he's saying is that there, among other things, he's saying there's a heavenly perspective on things that we need to grasp. And when we see things from the perspective of the throne, it's a whole different matter. One of the questions I have for you, you're going to get to in just a minute, is this question of what does he mean by he has put eternity into man's heart? I'm going to have you wrestle with that phrase. What does that mean? And it's interesting that the conflict that you see here, and it has a lot to do with what I was preaching about on Sunday, about the living under the curses. He puts eternity in our heart. There's this longing for things eternal in us, yet, the very next word is yet, we cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. In other words, there's this longing, there's this desire to understand eternal things, to understand God and understand what God is doing, and yet he's made it, the world the way it is right now for us, that we can't figure that out. So we live in this constant tension. People who are always just kind of smarmy, you know what smarmy means? Kind of syrupy, smarmy, joyful. Those people scare me. If you're an honest Christian, you have to feel everything that's in this list and everything that's in between the top and the bottom of this list. Honest Christians are sometimes sad Christians because the world's a sad place. Honest Christians are sometimes angry Christians because anger is the defender of justice, and we could go on and on through all of those. There's this tension we live in that we have to be honest about. And this sort of name it, claim it, prosperity thing, success thing, in the end is going to leave you terribly disappointed. He says, I perceive that there is nothing better for us than to be joyful and do good as long as we live, and that we should eat and drink and take pleasure in all of our toil. You talked about that. And then he goes on to give examples of the things in the world that are not joyful things. The injustice, verse 16. In the place of justice there was wickedness. In the place of righteousness even there was wickedness. And he goes on. And so to make sense out of all of that, he says God's going to judge. God's going to judge everybody. I thought, as I was reading that, I thought of Romans chapter 12 and Romans chapter 13. Tuesday September 11th was 9/11. Okay, it was a Tuesday, and then so the next night was Wednesday night, like this, Bible study, prayer time, and the church was packed with people. And I knew this was going to happen. They'll show up for 2 weeks and then they'll go back to whatever's driving their life. And I said, what do you say? Because everybody, we had a lot of military people in our church and so forth, and everybody was like, we needed, and I said, okay, take a deep breath. Romans 12 says, do not take revenge. Talking to the Christian now, okay? Do not take revenge, but leave room for my vengeance. I will repay, God says. And how can we do that? Because God has instituted, chapter 13, the government to take care of that for us. That the government and the military are instituted by God to take care of unrighteousness in society, and so let them do their job. But don't hate and don't take revenge. Don't take this out on your neighbors who are from another country. There's unrighteousness, there's injustice in the world, and God sees that this is all a test, or Solomon sees this is all a test in verse 18, to see if we have the right perspective. Now he goes on to talk about how men are like beasts and so forth and so on. He's not saying that in every aspect. He's talking about specifically what happens. Animals are born, they live, they die. People are born, they live, they die. Okay, and realize that the ancient Hebrews did not have a well-developed vision of eternity. They talk about going down to Sheol. They talk about being laid with their ancestors in the ground. They talk very sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? They're really fuzzy on the idea of heaven and so forth. All that's in the progress of Revelation in the New Testament. And you get a little bit of it in the prophets about the millennial kingdom and so forth. So when you're reading this and he says, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward or the spirit of beast goes down into the earth? We're all from dust, we return to dust. He's looking at this from the perspective of himself as an ancient Hebrew with not the theology that we have about heaven and the rapture and millennial, all that stuff, okay? So he's musing as a philosopher and as a poet and as a wise man. He's musing about what happens on earth to animals and people. It looks from his perspective like, what's the point? There's no difference. Your cat is born, your cat's going to die. You're born, you're going to die. It's all the same. So then he comes to the same conclusion, verse 22. So there's nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, because work is what we do. And finding some joy in what we do. Of course, in the New Testament, everything is infused, and I'll finish with this. This is really important. Everything is infused with a sense of the sacred when we come to faith in Christ. There is no such thing as a secular, sacred dichotomy in the life of the believer. Everything, whether you're washing dishes or cleaning diapers or whether you're preaching a sermon, or I like to ask this question: when was Jesus more holy? When he was sweeping the floor of his father's carpenter shop, or when he was preaching the Sermon on the Mount? When was he more righteous, more pleasing to God? When he was helping his mom clean up the kitchen, taking care of his younger siblings, or when he was hanging on a cross?
Well, if all sin is egregious to him, and all acts of submission and worship are joyful. So,
yeah. The answer was he was holy all of those times. And we tend to elevate certain activities to be obviously spiritual, but it's all spiritual. Everything's spiritual to the believer. And so we can find joy. We can find purpose in everything that we do, particularly if we do it unto the Lord and if we do it in love for the people around us. So I have some questions here for you, and I'm going to let you go, and you can go until 8 o'clock. My questions, I've been accused of doing group therapy when I teach and preach, so my questions are a little bit therapeutic. They're about what's going on inside of you, so just get over it. Have you ever questioned God's timing of something in your life? Were you able to see how God made that timing beautiful in its time? Can you think of a time when God had you in a transition from a certain season of life to something that was not just different, but actually opposite, and so forth? So we're going to do groups. The ladies are going to go off. You go into the thing in there, the room.